Recall that in the last video, one of the arguments for the view that abiogenesis occurs very easily was the up-it-pops argument. And we saw that Brandon Carter made the point that this argument overlooks a possible selection effect. If there are many hard steps on the path to intelligence, then on the vast majority of planets that contain intelligent observers, life will have arisen relatively early, even if it takes on average trillions of years to arise. Carter has a very interesting argument that builds on this reasoning. He's going to argue that we have good reason to believe that intelligence does indeed take a long time. We have good reason to believe that the expected time for the arrival of intelligence on a habitable planet is hundreds of billions or trillions of years or more, which of course is to say that the vast majority of habitable planets never develop intelligence. Only a few habitable planets where intelligence arises unusually early have intelligence, but intelligence is very rare in the universe. Now, Carter's argument here doesn't identify any particular steps on the path to intelligence that are hard. The conclusion is just there are some hard steps. So even if the emergence of life, for example, turned out to be very probable, very easy, Carter's argument would still apply. Even if we were to discover life on Europa and Titan, Carter would say we should still be very pessimistic about the probability of a SETI success. In terms of the Drake equation, Carter's argument is basically that the conjunction of FL and FI is extremely low. So the argument goes like this. Carter says, take three time intervals. We have the time interval T1, and this is the expected average time for the evolution of intelligent observers on a habitable planet. It's the expected time for intelligence to arise on a habitable planet. And of course, if we want to know how prevalent intelligence is in the galaxy, we need to know T1. If the expected average time for the emergence of intelligence is a billion years, then it must be very common. On the other hand, if the expected average time is tens of trillions of years, then it would be very, very rare. Only a few lucky planets would develop intelligence. So this is a very important quantity. Okay, then we have the interval T2, and this is the time taken by biological evolution on this planet to produce intelligent life, which of course is about 4.3 billion years. The Earth became habitable about 4.3 billion years ago, and intelligence has only very recently arisen. Well, I mean, I suppose I should add, when I say intelligence, of course what I mean is the kind of intelligence that can build radio telescopes and send signals out into space. Because of course, in the context of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, I suppose what we're really looking for is intelligent civilizations. I suppose animals have their own kind of intelligence, but that wouldn't be detectable. So it's intelligent civilized life that we're talking about here. Anyway, T3 is the habitability window, and this is the time during which life and intelligence could possibly exist on a planet. Basically, this is the time during which there is liquid water and a reasonably clement environment. As we saw in the previous video, this is about 5 billion years on Earth, because the increasing luminosity of the sun will extinguish complex life in about 600 to 800 million years. So on Earth, we got about 5 billion years. Now, one point here that's very important to bear in mind is Carter is assuming that M-type stars are unsuitable for intelligent life. Here's a chart of stellar types and their lifespans. Type G and type K stars are generally thought to be the best for intelligent life. And these are going to permit habitability windows of, I don't know, maybe 3 to 20 billion years, something like that, depending on where the planet is in the habitable zone. But about 3 to 20 billion years for those types of stars. Now notice that if you take type M stars, their lifetimes are much, much longer. M stars are low mass stars, and they're by far the most common type of star in the universe. Their habitability windows may extend for hundreds of billions or even trillions of years. Now, the general consensus among astrobiologists is that M-type stars would be unsuitable for complex intelligent life. They have a number of features that would make complex life very difficult. I mean, this is still up for debate. There are certainly those who think that intelligence around M stars would be plausible, but for this video we're going to just go with the standard assumption and rule those out as Carter does. So we'll say that T3 is in the billions or tens of billions of years. Right then, so our question really is, what is T1? Right, what's the expected time for intelligence to arise? That's what we need to know to estimate the prevalence of intelligence in our galaxy. Now, there are, of course, a huge range of possibilities here, and Carter splits the possibilities into three camps. So these basically are three hypotheses that Carter is going to discuss. Hypothesis A is that T1 is substantially less than T3. So the expected time for the emergence of intelligence is substantially less than the habitability window. Hypothesis B is that T1 is approximately the same as T3, within an order of magnitude, say. Maybe the expected time for the emergence of intelligence is 5 to 10 billion years. Then it will arise on some habitable planets and not others. And finally, we have hypothesis C. The expected time for the emergence of intelligence is substantially greater than the habitability window. And in this case, as I've said, intelligence will be very rare. For the vast majority of habitable planets, it won't arise. And so this would require that there are a number of very hard steps on the path to intelligence. So the question is, which of these is true? Obviously, we have only one data point, our Earth. But Carter thinks that actually our data is evidence for C. It's evidence for the claim that the expected time for intelligence is far greater than the habitability window, so in which case intelligence will be rare. So let's take A. Well, Carter says that this is empirically disconfirmed by the observation that T2 is approximately the same as T3. So the actual time taken on Earth to produce intelligent life is close to the time of the habitability window. So Earth, as I said, it took about 4.3 billion years to produce intelligence, but the habitability window is only 5 billion years. The times are very similar. Intelligence did not arise quickly. But if A were true, if the expected time for the emergence of intelligence was much lower than the habitability window, well, we would expect it to have arisen earlier on Earth. We'd have to suppose that on Earth there must have been some very improbable events that stymied the arrival of intelligence. But I mean, these events would be improbable, which is just to say it probably didn't happen that way. So Carter thinks we have evidence against A, and that leaves us with B and C. Now, it should be clear that the observation that T2 approximates T3, this does not disconfirm C due to the selection effect. Obviously, we could never observe the emergence of intelligence take longer than T3. Intelligence can only arise within T3. It can only arise within the habitability window. If the expected time for intelligence to arise is much longer than the habitability window, it will simply fail to arise on most planets. On a lucky few planets, it will happen within that habitability window. And we must be among those lucky planets where it happens quicker than average because we are intelligent observers. So the observation that T2 approximates T3 is no evidence against C. It's no evidence against the idea that the expected time for intelligence is far greater than the habitability window. So it allows us to rule out A, but not C. What about B? Well, Carter says that B can be judged to be very unlikely just a priori. B puts T1 within a very small range of possible values, and we have no particular reason to think that T1 would be within this range. So that is, we have no particular reason to think that the expected time for the emergence of intelligence would be anywhere close to the habitability window. The habitability window is determined by astrophysical factors like the mass of the star, the rate of thermonuclear fusion in the star's core, changes in the star's luminosity over time, and so on. The emergence of intelligence depends on biological processes. On our planet, it required the evolution of eukaryotes and complex multicellularity, the evolution of photosynthesis, the evolution of sex. Now, these astrophysical and biological factors have nothing to do with each other, or so it seems, and so there's no reason to suppose that the average time during which a star can support habitability would be similar to the average time taken for intelligence to emerge. So B is very is unlikely then, because it puts T1 in a very small range of values, even though there's no reason to think that T1 would be within that range. If this argument is unclear, here's an analogy. Suppose Frank chooses a number from 1 to 1000. We don't know what he's chosen, we just know he's picked a number, and we have no reason to assume that Frank is going to be biased towards any particular number. Now consider these three hypotheses about Frank's number. So, A star, the number is within 1 to 500, B star, the number is 500 to 510, C star, the number is 511 to 1000. So it looks like we would probably rule out B star as being much less likely than A star or C star. Maybe Frank picked a number from this range, it's just not very likely. I mean, you wouldn't bet on it, right? So what Carter is saying is a similar point applies to hypothesis B. B says that T1 is close to T3. It says that the expected time for intelligence is about the same as the habitability window, maybe somewhere between 5 to 20 billion years. That's a small range of values out of a very wide range of possible values. Given that there's no reason to think that the true value lies within this range, we should rule it out as being unlikely. So, summing up, the observation of a late arrival of intelligence on Earth makes it highly improbable that the expected time for intelligence is much shorter than the habitability window. That leaves us with hypothesis B and C. T1 is about the same as T3, or T1 is much longer than T3. The empirical evidence here doesn't discriminate between either, because we can't rule out C due to the selection effect, but just a priori we can say it's probably in the much longer range. T1 is probably in the much longer range because that's a much larger range of values. So we have reason to believe that intelligence is going to be very, very rare. Intelligence arises, the expected time for the arrival of intelligence is very great, much greater than the habitability window. This argument has been quite popular with critics of SETI, of the searching for extraterrestrial life, intelligence, and it is kind of an ingenious argument. It tries to draw some big conclusions from very limited data, but there are some problems with it. So let's have a look at those. First of all, hopefully you can see why, as I mentioned earlier, Carter's argument depends on the assumption that M-type stars are not suitable for intelligent life. Since they live for trillions of years, T3, the habitability window, would have to be extended to trillions of years if such stars can sustain intelligence. And then if T1 were very great, the vast majority of intelligent observers would find themselves around M stars. We would be the odd ones out. Recall the lock-picking example from the previous video. There's a vault with £1 million behind 6 locks. Each lock is very difficult, takes an average of 10 or 20 hours to complete each lock. If you have one group of players given 1 hour to pick all 6 and another group of players given, 50 hours to pick all 6, almost all the successful players will be in the latter group. So one way to object to Carter's argument it would be to argue that the M stars are suitable for intelligence. That would extend the habitability window very substantially. A second objection, given by Patrick Wilson in the article Carter on Anthropic Principle Predictions, is that Carter is not really entitled to rule out hypothesis A, the claim that T1 is substantially less than T3. Wilson says that Carter's reasoning here rests on a fallacy. So it's true that given T1, we wouldn't expect T2 to differ much from T1. Given T1, we would predict that T2 would be close to T1. So if we know T1, if we know the expected average time for intelligence to arise, we could then predict T2, the actual time taken for intelligence to arise. And of course, we would predict that the actual time taken for intelligence to arise is close to the expected time taken for intelligence to arise. What we're doing here is inferring T2 from T1. We're inferring the actual time taken for intelligence to arise from the expected time for intelligence to arise. So if we know that T1 is relatively short, then when we investigate the history of life and find that T2 is much longer, that would be surprising. But Carter makes the opposite inference. He tries to infer T1 from T2. He tries to infer the expected average time for intelligence to arise from the actual time taken for intelligence to arise on the Earth. And the problem is that T1 is a statistical average. And Wilson says you can't really infer this kind of average from just one single case. We can only know T1 by knowing a variety of different cases of intelligence arising, or maybe by knowing more about the time scales governing long-term evolutionary processes or whatever. But certainly, just from the fact that intelligence took a long time to arise on Earth, that doesn't really tell us much about the expected average time for intelligence to arise. Suppose I take an organism from an unspecified species, and this organism is currently 50 years old. What does this tell us about the life expectancy of the species? I mean, can we say, well, clearly the life expectancy is not significantly lower than 50? I mean, maybe our single organism decreases the probability of this slightly. Maybe it slightly decreases the probability that the life expectancy is significantly lower than 50, but it's not good evidence. We only have one case here. With one case, it wouldn't be too surprising for it to be anomalous. And anyway, maybe looking at it in terms of average life expectancy is misleading. Perhaps most members of the species, say 60%, die at 10. But if you live past 10, you're likely to make it to 60. This is actually similar to how human life expectancy worked for a long time. In the past, most humans died in childhood, but if you got to puberty, if you made it to puberty, then you were likely to live to your 50s or 60s. So, suppose the average time for intelligence is only 500 million years or whatever, then our planet, where it took over 4 billion years, is something of an outlier, but it's not much of an outlier, and it's only one case, so can we really infer much from this? I mean, I'm not sure how convincing this objection really is. I mean, after all, if you found an organism of 10,000 years old, well, you could say that life expectancy probably isn't 20 years, say. And bear in mind, Carter only claims that A is unlikely given our current evidence. The evidence points against A. It may be weak evidence, so it wouldn't be too surprising if it turns out that A is actually true, but weak evidence is still evidence, and we can only arrive at conclusions based on the evidence available. So maybe Carter can respond to this objection. A third objection. Let's consider this idea that we can rule out hypothesis B as being a priori unlikely. One major problem with Carter's reasoning here is that it seems you can apply the same reasoning to derive absurd conclusions. So here's hypothesis B and hypothesis C again. So Carter says that we can rule out B because it's a very small range of values compared to the very large range of values covered by C. But now suppose we split C into two hypotheses. So C1 tells us that the expected time for intelligence to arise is somewhere between 100 billion and 100 trillion years. C2 tells us the expected time for intelligence to arise is somewhere between 100 trillion to 1 Google years. Of course, in both cases, the expected time for intelligence to arise is far greater than the habitability window. Now, notice there are far more possible values in C2 than in C1. So applying Carter's reasoning, it looks like we should rule out C1 as being unlikely. After all, the available evidence doesn't discriminate between either hypothesis. If it takes on average 1 Google years for intelligence to arise, then I think we can be pretty sure that we're the only intelligent life in the observable universe. Indeed, in order for this to make sense, we would have to postulate either an infinite universe or a multiverse. But then that's a standard hypothesis within physics, so can't rule it out. Certainly there's no evidence against it at this point. We don't know how extensive reality is. And of course, in an infinite multiverse, the emergence of intelligence can be as unlikely as you want, and it's still guaranteed to have occurred somewhere. So, by Carter's argument, it looks like we should favour C2. We should say that C2 is the most likely. And the problem here is that the same procedure can be applied indefinitely, so that we end up counting ever greater values for T1 as being more likely. Clearly, we can apply this same kind of reasoning to just push the expected time for intelligence to arise to ever greater and greater heights, and there does seem to be something rather absurd about that. Okay, a final objection. So Carter rules out hypothesis B, not just because it's a priori unlikely, but also a key part of his argument is that there is no reason to expect that T1 approximates T3. There's no reason to expect that the expected time for the emergence of intelligence approximates the habitability window. If we did have reason to expect this, if we did have reason to expect this, then the a priori unlikeliness of B would be irrelevant. Mario Livio, in his article "How Rare Are Extraterrestrial Civilizations," argues that actually we do have good reason to think that T1 will approximate T3. Astrophysical timescales and evolutionary timescales are linked. So contrary to Carter's assumption, T1 and T3 are not independent. So one thing I mentioned in the last video in support of Carter's objection to the up it pops argument is that one reason why life might have to arise fairly early on planets with intelligence is that it takes time for oxygen to build up. But this point can actually be turned against Carter's own argument, because the oxygenation of the atmosphere might induce a correlation between T1 and T3. Oxygenation is arguably required for intelligence for a few reasons. First of all, ultraviolet radiation in certain bands is lethal to nucleic acids and proteins. In a low oxygen atmosphere, this radiation penetrates to the surface, and so this would seem to prevent land life. Now, luckily, these bands are very effectively absorbed by ozone. So arguably, the emergence of land life required the development of ozone. The ozone layer must form before life can leave the protection of the oceans. And of course, ozone is formed from oxygen. And second, another very important point about oxygen is aerobic respiration, much more efficient than anaerobic respiration. So oxygen supports much more complex life. Now, oxygen rises in the atmosphere through two main processes. First, the photodissociation of water vapour, which breaks H2O into hydrogen and oxygen. And secondly, biological processes like photosynthesis. Now, Livio points out that the time scale for the photodissociation of water vapour is dependent on the intensity of ultraviolet radiation. And this is dependent on the stellar type. Larger stars, which have shorter lifespans and so shorter habitability windows, emit more intense UV radiation in the habitable zones, and so oxygen will tend to increase more quickly. So the point is the rise of oxygen is dependent on the stellar type, and it also has a significant influence on the possibility of intelligence. If oxygen arises more quickly, intelligence can be possible sooner. So Livio says T1 and T3 are connected, which means Carter's argument against B fails. Another example of a possible connection is suggested by Paul Davies in his book The Eerie Silence. Davies points out that there are many astrophysical phenomena that can threaten life. Gamma ray bursts are extremely powerful explosions, among the most powerful events known in the universe. If one of these occurred close to an inhabited planet, it would sterilize much of its life and so hinder the development of intelligence. And Davies says that gamma ray bursts and similar astrophysical catastrophes were more common in the past. So perhaps the expected time for intelligence is relatively short these days in the calmer universe, but the emergence of intelligence was frustrated on Earth in the past by gamma rays, by gamma ray bursts. So in other words, the expected time for the emergence of intelligence on Earth was longer, closer to the end of the habitability window, because Earth was formed during a more violent time in the galaxy. And so what all of this suggests, again, is we can't rule out hypothesis B. The expected time for intelligence may well approximate the habitability window, because there may be all sorts of factors that induce a correlation between the expected time for the emergence of intelligence and the time of the habitability window. So that's Carter's argument and a few of the objections to it. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.